All right. Well, listen, everybody, we're glad for those of you who made it over here to Zoom. We're obviously having technical difficulties this morning, but we still want to have a very good conversation about what the nation believes about its schooling options right now. I'm Chris Stewart. I'm the CEO of brightbeam. We spend a lot of time working with students, educators, parents, to lift up their voices and hear what they have to say about schooling and, their educational options for their families. So it's only, fitting that I would be here today with folks from EdChoice to have a similar conversation. But the difference between me and EdChoice is that EdChoice comes with data. They come with information. They come with an informed view. They don't just come with, hey, this is what I think about the issues. So, here's the quick frame on a discussion that we would have today that we had planned for you all. The quick frame is this, a little over a year ago, tens of millions of kids were waking up every morning to go to traditional public schools, private schools, but some sort of formal schooling option. And that was just a little bit over a year ago. And boy, a year later, does the world look different? Have things really changed, right? Just within a year. Now imagine going through all of your lifetime and within 1 year having something so fundamental as schooling completely change and become a completely different thing. And for the first time ever, many parents in the United States have to, on a daily basis, exercise the muscles around deciding what their kids will learn, how they will learn it, who they will learn it from. And the way that this is playing out in the press and in the media is there are these kind of this or that debates around school openings and school closings, around private schools versus traditional district schools, remote learning versus all in person. Of course, that's too narrow framing. There's some nuances to be had if we want to have a more broad discussion. So I'm happy to be with Mike McShane from EdChoice, who's the Director of National Research, and Jennifer Wagner, who is the Vice President of Communications for EdChoice, to have this discussion. So guys, let's jump right in, especially since we have time. We're more on a time restriction than we were before. I will say to anyone who has questions, thoughts, or ideas, please put them into the chat. I will be watching the chat and we can get your questions answered. But you do national polling at EdChoice. You do monthly polling of, and correct me if I'm wrong, you do national polling of the general population, and then quarterly polling of teachers and educators. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So can we start with the most front of mind type of battle that we see, just to see what you have discovered or what you learn about what the public really believes about closings and reopenings, which seems to be, it takes all the air out of the room in terms of the media play. So help me out. Help me understand where the public is on the question of opening or staying closed.
For sure. So we've been asking this question obviously since May of 2020, and we asked parents, and we've asked teachers as well. But the parent numbers, based on what you have seen, read, or heard about the coronavirus outbreak so far, how comfortable are you with your child or children returning to school right now? A pretty straightforward, basic question. And I can tell you, with some minor fluctuations, but basically since we have started asking that question, responses have been a 50-50 split. About half of respondents say that they're comfortable with their kids going back to school, and about half of respondents said that they aren't. These have fluctuated a little bit with sort of case counts and things. So I think the kind of peak of comfort arrived back in kind of August, September time, when it was closer to about 60% of folks who were comfortable with their kids going back to school. It was a trough kind of back in the November, December time, but even then it was kind of down in the 40s. So we've really been basically seeing a kind of 55-45 split one way or the other as long as we've been asking this question.
Yeah, and I think, back to your point, Chris, and thanks everyone for being flexible here and getting on this. We would ordinarily share our PowerPoint presentation with you, but we can't get that done either. But to your point about the national, there it is. It's old-fashioned PowerPoint. The national conversation about reopenings, it's become so political and so divided, with one side saying, oh, we've got to get kids back in school no matter what, and the other side maybe saying like, hey, let's exercise caution, which is what makes these numbers so interesting and so useful, is that we actually have a direct line to parents, and they're split right down the middle, and if we had more time, could get into some of the crosstabs and the demographic breakdowns, but that narrative of if this or that is not how parents are actually viewing this. And I did want to real quick, for those of you who are not familiar with EdChoice, give just like the 20-second overview of who we are. We're the nation's oldest school choice advocacy organization. We focus our efforts on research, which is what we're talking about here, training, and state-based advocacy. And we've been around 25 years, and we are the only national group doing this kind of recurring public polling right now. We kind of lucked into it. We started last January, and then of course the pandemic hit, so we were able to adapt and ask some of these questions on an ongoing basis. But if you want more information about this polling and our other polling work, our website is edchoice.org, and I would encourage you to check that out, because there's a lot of information there, both on the national level, and you can check out what the trend lines are in your state as well. So back to you, Chris.
No, I mean, I want to broaden the question a little bit, though. We do get in this bifurcated, view of for or against, and you just mentioned the crosstabs. So you guys talk to different types of parents, different types of, they might be different in where they're located, geographically, they may be different culturally, and they may be different in their income, for instance. Do you guys notice anything without having to go to all your crosstabs? Is there anything you can tell us about maybe the differences between what parents are thinking about closing and reopening based upon where they live or their status economically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can tell you, actually, you know what? I pulled up the wrong crosstabs. Hang on. I'm okay. Based on what you've seen, how comfortable are you? So yeah, breaking down some of these groups that we're looking at, I'll just use for simple, the percentage of people who say that they are very comfortable. So you could say very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, not that comfortable, or not comfortable at all. But so here are the people who are very comfortable. So if you want to break it down by racial demographics, so white respondents, 24% said that they were very comfortable. Only 16% of African American and 11% of Asian American, and Hispanic folks were 20%. So white folks were the most likely to say that. If you're looking based on income, high income people, so there's an income of more than $75,000 a year, 34% of them were very comfortable, but low income, less than 35,000, only 10%.
Wow.
So big spread there across the income spectrum. And then if we want to look geographically, those that are in an urban area were 26%, and they were the most likely. Suburban was only 19, small town was 24, and rural was 22. So it's a pretty tight distribution there, with urban being the highest and suburban being the lowest. So again, I mean, this is the wild thing with these crosstabs, is that they cut across all of these different groups and things. But yeah, I think that the strongest difference that we see there is actually in income.
I mean, that's an important point to pull out, though, because if you think about it, that was a pretty wide spread, right?
For sure.
So like if we were to average everybody together, we would say, well, it's kind of mixed, but it's not really kind of mixed when you pull in that income tab. And I wonder if that's a function of levels of trust with schools. I mean, if you've lived in very well-resourced schools that generally run well and have competent leadership, you might feel differently about it than if you have been in some of the left behind schools. Your trust level that they will get something so important as like safety, right, would be really interesting. You guys also did some work around trying to figure out how parents and the public feel about different levels of government's responsibility for closing and reopening. Who'd you see that came out more favorable in terms of how the public feels about the handling of closings and reopenings?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, regardless of the level of government that we talk to, or that we ask about, or even the institutions that we ask about, they're all, to borrow a term from polling, they're all above water. That is, more people think that they're doing a good job as opposed to a bad job. So that's the first thing that's sort of important, that regardless of what we're talking about. But when we think of the kind of total approval rating, the highest rating, so we asked about the Biden administration, state governors, local teachers unions, local school boards, state public health officials, and national teachers unions. The highest approval rating went to local school boards. 65% of respondents said that. The lowest went to national teachers unions at 55%. But again, all of those folks that we're talking about there, that's the range between 65 and 55% of people expressing approval of how those folks have been handling it.
So school boards really come out the big winners in that one. The public is okay. So even asking about that though, and you guys are like the numbers people, you're super smart and all that stuff. So we're just gonna I'm just gonna, talk to me like I'm someone who really needs to understand this though. But when you have 45% of the people still not who are on the other side of this, isn't that a pretty sizable number to not be satisfied?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what's been interesting.
Like 45% seems like a lot.
65, 45, it's not 80, 20, it's not 90, 10. So you can get, and depending on if you imagine like drawing a representative sample of 100 people in a room, if you were in a room that's like a 65, 45 split, you might say like, whoa, this is very divided, right? Like if you're at like a football game where the crowd is like 65, 45, it's difficult to a layperson to necessarily say, wait, who's got more of these folks? It's different when it's 90, 10 or 85, 15. So yeah, you're right. So while these folks are above water, it's not a slam dunk. These are folks, there's still a substantial minority of folks who are not happy with the way reopening has been handled by these various different institutions.
So school board members, if you're listening to this, don't pat yourself on the back and go, oh, we're good. We're good. The public loves us. Because a big percentage of the public still has questions. Were you going to say something, Jennifer?
Well, I was actually just going to link that question to the question that we ask every month about, right track, wrong track in terms of education nationwide, statewide, and at your local school district level. Because, again, don't pat yourself on the back just yet, because we see, in February of this year, only 28% of all adults that we polled said that we're going in the right direction nationally, and that tips up to 35% at the local level. But that means, if that's the right track, then the wrong track is definitely the opposite of that, which again says, maybe we're not doing all that great at this responding to the pandemic thing. And I think, some of our other responses bear that out, that people are looking at options now that they didn't know existed before, and they're creating new options, and we'll see where we wind up after the pandemic.
So to build on that just a little bit, and this is where data gets confusing, or like when different questions come into play. So I noticed that since the beginning of your time on the graph that I saw that you were tracking, that in all levels, the public was saying, it had, the right track people had declined. That's what I said. The portion of the public that was saying we're on the right track with education has declined since the starting point to now. And that was for all areas, like the people who think about your local schools or just schools generally nationally or whatever. They thought they were all on the wrong, going more trending towards people think it was on the wrong track. You also have a data point though around the number of parents since October who are comfortable with sending their kids back to school. It finally hit higher than half, which means it's going the other direction, in that now there are more parents starting to say that they're okay with kids returning to school. First of all, how do you make sense of more people thinking we're on the wrong track, but more willing to send their kids back to school? For one, is it like that people just decided we don't love our kids as much as we thought, which I'm sure is not the answer. And second, what do you think is responsible for the uptick, if the uptick in the number of people being comfortable with sending back their kids back to school? Is it the vaccine? Is it some optimism around things are getting better?
Yeah, a couple things to unpack there. So the right track, wrong track question is a question we're asking of all Americans, whether they have kids or not.
Okay.
And the question we have about sending kids back to school, we're asking to parents themselves. And generally, we actually have pulled out, if you pull school parents out on the right track, wrong track, the trends are the same, but the levels are a little bit higher. parents tend to have a higher view of their education system than the general public does. It's, again, we saw the same thing where there was a kind of an interesting increase around last April. There was clearly a kind of rally around the flag thing, like we're all in this together. And so it's actually showed up in other questions we've asked of, like, should schools get more money or should teachers be paid more? We saw all of those things trend upward last, like, April, which you imagine was like kind of height of lockdown. We're all in this, and ever since then it's all just kind of ticked downward. I think it's sort of, it didn't crash back to reality, but it perhaps glided back down to reality. So I think when it comes to coming back to kids being comfortable coming back into school, you know, some of the other questions we've asked around things like vaccines and others tend to me to show growing optimism. So for example, we just asked questions about, like, would people be willing to get a vaccine, or what are they thinking about that? And all of those numbers have trended upward every time we've asked. More and more folks are saying we're comfortable with this, more and more folks. So I think there's just a general kind of optimism trend there. And so again, it's going to be interesting to see in the total public, if while these other measures of optimism are happening, but they're still kind of pessimistic about our schools. That's a sort of interesting thing to think about. But I think that's kind of what's happening there. But you're right, there's a lot of cross currents.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I don't wear a polling hat. I wear the communications hat, so it means I get to make stuff up and hypothesize where Mike has to stick to the facts, just the
For
facts.
people listening, that is not what communications means. Just so people listening.
That's true. We don't make stuff up, but I do get to, you know, kind of sit and interpret the data. And I think you see through all of our questions, as Mike just said, you know, you get a bit of an uptick and then a downward sense of that optimism. I will say that we reached our lowest points, though, for those of us who live in states where there are seasons in November, December, January, when, you know, all of a sudden you couldn't go outside in school and engage in schooling activities with your kids. You were either stuck at the dining room table or your kids were going back in person, but they couldn't really go anywhere outside the building. So, you know, I think to your point, Chris, the vaccine for sure. And we do poll likeliness to get the vaccine. We see those numbers inching up every month as we get more people vaccinated. And I think people get more comfortable with that. So no, we don't make things up in communications, but we do have a little latitude to interpret.
More than Mike has when he's doing the number stuff, right? Yeah. So people saying that they're comfortable going back to school is not them. It's not the same thing as them saying that they're comfortable with going back to the same thing they had before. So what would you guys say in terms of proof or evidence that parents are thinking about some different things than what they would have done before?
Sure. Well, we've asked a question again since the beginning about homeschooling. How has the question, based on what you've, oh no, look, I pulled up the wrong thing. So we asked about, we asked about likelihood, or how your views on the pandemic have changed your views of homeschooling. Would you be more likely to send your kids home? Did you have a more positive view of that? And it's something that we've seen throughout the course of the pandemic, large groups of people saying that they would be more comfortable homeschooling their children in the future. Now, been interesting because we've looked at, just like I said in some of those earlier questions, we give different levels. I'm not at all comfortable, a little bit comfortable, a little bit, you know, like we basically have those 4 areas there. And for a while, the highest confidence, like back in July, it peaked in like the 40s. It was like, I am much more interested in homeschooling as a result of that. Now, that top end number has ticked down to kind of the mid 20s, which is close to where it was at the beginning. But the people who are somewhat more, so the people who clearly are just kind of more open to the idea, maybe they're not the folks that are going to be manning the ramparts to try and get this started, has only increased. So I think more than half of the people that we polled said that they're at least open to these ideas in the future. And I think that kind of gets into the thoughts that parents have, where they're saying, wow, like, again, I might not necessarily do it, but I'm more open to the idea. I'm interested in those things happening. So that's been definitely an interesting trend we've seen for months now.
I will say, though, the homeschooling number to me, and I have school-age children, I think a lot of parents out there may be confused about what homeschooling is. I think we've seen a little bit of variation from month to month, in part because of that. Because, you know, I may think I'm homeschooling my kids. I'm not. I'm, when they're remote learning, I'm taking the curriculum that the school is sending me. They're zooming in to be with their teachers. That is not the traditional sense of homeschooling. But I think, and this is, if you're out there, I wish I could put this up on the screen. Maybe Mike can hold it up old school style. But we do ask what kinds of learning environments parents want after the pandemic. And this to me is the most fascinating finding, and we'll see if it holds true. But for a couple of months now, 45% of all school parents that we asked, we said, hey, if given the option, to what extent would you prefer schooling to be scheduled each week, in a home environment with a parent or tutor, or in person? And 45% of parents said they want a mix of schooling at home versus schooling outside of the home. 2 to 3 days at home is the most preferred for those that choose that mix. That jumps up to 64% of private school parents and 42% of district school parents. So to me, wow, like people still want to do this hybrid schooling thing that we've all been doing and thrown into over the last year after the pandemic is over. And I actually asked my kids this morning before I took them to their brick and mortar school, and they were like, no, we would love to do that. We would love to have a couple days at home, a couple days at school. So that is a fascinating trend. And I know, Mike's done some research and has a new book coming out on Sunday about this very topic.
All of you can head to your local online book retailer and see my new book, Hybrid Homeschooling, A Guide to the Future of Education, which comes out on Sunday.
Awesome. Here's my book. I find this really fascinating because this is, what you're talking about is like hybrid schooling, basically a hybrid model. I love a couple of points that you raised there. The first one is I would hope that we're getting more sophisticated about asking parents about their version of homeschooling. Because right now there's a lot of crisis parenting schooling going on in the home, and that's not homeschooling. That's crisis parenting schooling, which is way different. And people who homeschool for real want to keep hammering that point home to us. Like they want to keep saying, stop calling it homeschooling. And I just know in my own house that our kids are not big fans of the district provided remote schooling. So if you were to ask them, would you rather stay home and just have full homeschooling, or would you rather go back to school? They probably would choose either of those versus continuing with the remote schooling. That's what they don't like. Mike, so you've written a whole book on this now, this hybrid schooling. What were your big what's your big push and your big message around what you found as you were writing the book around hybrid schooling?
Yeah, the funny thing is I started it before the pandemic happened. So I was looking at this very kind of niche thing that schools all across the country, and for now, some since like the early 90s, have been doing. And then obviously the pandemic happens and it just rockets into everyone's minds. And I think exactly to the points that both of you have made, what's happening now isn't really the same kind of hybrid homeschooling. Like building a school from the ground up to function on this schedule is different than trying to figure it out on the fly with people who may be interested in it and may not. The subtitle to my book is A Guide to the Future of Education. And I didn't really realize as that was coming out exactly how soon the future was going to show up, because the point that I was actually trying to make with that is not that I think everyone in the future is going to be in a hybrid homeschool, but the questions that hybrid homeschooling asks about education are going to be important. And I think that the pandemic has only magnified that. So these questions about how do schools use time? How do they use the school day, the school week, and the school year? And how does that sync with families? How does that sync with family life and other things that kids are trying to do? I think the pandemic has caused us to ask those questions. Schools that have tried an alternative schedule or a calendar have also asked those questions. And I think a big question too is just like, how do schools work with families to provide the best learning environments for kids? And many of these hybrid homeschools that existed before the pandemic are really tight-knit groups because they're trying to do something interesting and unique. And it relies on both parents and teachers to play a really active role in what's happening there. And again, the pandemic has raised these things as children have dispersed back into their homes and parents have to play a bigger role. These are the exact things that they're wrestling with right now. And as kids, Lord willing, head back to school, and get access to higher quality learning options that they have, that question about how can parents and schools work together is not going away, right? Like, and how do we make these good, strong communities that support kids, and there's schools where teachers want to teach and kids want to learn and parents are psyched to send their kids there. That's not going away. And so I think this has only sort of magnified those questions.
Excuse me. I would hope that parents and people with resources are starting to find each other, and that they're starting to have conversations in their communities about what's possible. I know that you all have done some of the ways that you've asked the questions have made a difference between private school parents, traditional homeschooling parents, and the general public. Were there any nuances between the differences of belief between those sets of parents?
Let's see, I've got to pull up my correct slide to answer that, or maybe Mike's
Yeah, I
got
thought
it in
I
front of
looked
him.
through
Yeah,
some
I
stuff
can-
and I thought I saw something that was like slightly different
Yeah, so
about the way that private school parents were looking at issues versus others.
yeah, so we've asked this question: how do you feel your child or children is or are progressing this school year? And we broke that out by traditional public schools, homeschooled, and private schooled parents across 3 different dimensions: academic learning, emotional development, and social development. In all 3 of those cases, private school parents have been most likely to say that their children are doing very well this school year. Homeschooling parents come in second, and traditional public parents come in third. And in some cases, the gap, particularly between the private school parents and the traditional public school parents, is large. So in social development, 50% of private school parents said that their children are doing very well with social development, and only 22% of public school parents are saying that. Now, I tend to think that private schools have been more likely to be in person, where kids are having those social interactions with one another. That's probably one of the most stark, but the same trends we're seeing in academic learning and in emotional development.
That leaves like a clear winner for private school parents, and then traditional homeschool parents or whatnot. It ranks kind of like a hierarchy when you start reading those results. But in truth, you have parents now that are starting to do kind of a blend of things, and I don't know if we've started capturing them yet. And I don't know, is there anything in your research around pods, parents who are doing the pod stuff?
There is. If you go to the website, there we have polled on that question for a few months now, and I'm trying to get that pulled up here, or maybe Mike can find that more quickly. But
I'll vamp while you pull it up. To the point that again both of you made earlier that I think is right. So we asked this question about participating in pods back at the beginning of the last school year, and it's like, are you going to participate in a pod, or are you interested in it? And we had this enormous response. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but like half of respondents or something crazy said that they were participating in a pod. And that made us think, we're like, I don't know if I trust those numbers. That seemed way too many. It's like 25 million kids participating. So then we asked the question, when we say pod, are you starting like a little independent private school of like 5 families, or are you all just coming together to do your district remote learning, but you're just all doing it in the same house? And it turns out that the vast majority of people, when they think of a pod right now, they think of like, well, we're just all in one house doing the district stuff. So it's a much smaller minority of schools or of families that are actually doing, a lot of times when we think of pods, which is like an independent entity, like a little micro school of families. Jen, I don't know if that bought you enough time.
It did. Yeah, thank you very much. You bought me just enough time
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining that too, because the initial numbers we got back were like, oh my gosh, this is a massive reform sweeping the country, and people are potting up and making their own little schools. And right now, as of last month, we have 19% of school parents say they are participating in a pod, but most of them, 77%, that is in addition to or supplementing their regular schooling. We also do have pod participation broken down by demographic and regional group. And, not particularly surprisingly, the most likely folks who would join into a pod are private school parents or homeschool parents, higher income earners, folks with more higher education. But you've also got some, Northeastern, Western, urban, and then you have 40% of Black school parents said, they would be likely to join a pod. compare that over to the less likely, you've got your district school parents, Republicans, suburban, rural parents responding that they would be less likely to join in a pod from the prior month. And I think, Chris, you mentioned this in the intro, like we do have a lot of that information broken down by demographic group. And I know Paul, our VP of research, who is on this, had chatted to us that even in the hybrid homeschooling question, there's a huge difference in respondents between Black parents and white parents. You definitely see some differences across the socioeconomic spectrum. So we want to be careful in presenting this information to say that, this is not true for everyone just because of that big average number that we're talking about here. The only other thing I did want to hit on too, and I would be bad at my job if I didn't, because we are a school choice organization, and I wanted to make sure we had time to get to the fact that in our research every month, even before the pandemic, we ask about the popularity of the favorability of school choice programs or school choice types. So whether that's a voucher, a tax credit scholarship, charter schools, or education savings accounts, those are the 4 types that we poll on every month. And I think reflective of the fact that parents are looking for different options or maybe trying to piecemeal together what they do after the pandemic, we have seen support for every single type of choice go through the roof over the last year. And also year to year. So I'm looking at the so education savings accounts are this, kind of cool new-ish thing. They've been around for a while that lets you not just pay for private school tuition, but you can pay for tutoring, you can pay for support services, you can pay for therapy, kind of allows you to customize your kids' education. And we poll every year on those. Back in 2013, when we first started doing a national poll, that the number for those was support at 64%. We just saw it at 81% last fall. So, I mean, you've just got overwhelming favorability for the ability to go somewhere else, try something new, do your own thing, which is pretty remarkable.
Paul DePerna has a great question here too about these findings that you all have. His question around them is, what does it say for federal policy and for public policy, I think in general? You just mentioned ESAs, which is one form of school choice that we're seeing more legislation. We're seeing more places in the country, more states actually take a vested interest in making sure that parents have direct resources to educate their young people. Do you have any other ideas or thoughts around how this polling that you were doing has an impact on or contributes to public policy?
Look, I think across all of them. I mean, ESAs are crushing the hardest, but tax credit scholarships, vouchers, charter schools, I mean, we've seen increases, and particularly like Jen cited the 2013 numbers. They actually kind of some of them took a bit of a dip back in 2016-ish. So the increase since then is even more dramatic. But it just seems to me across the board. And again, we get this thing where we're polling people every month now. And so, a wiggle here, a wobble there, we think maybe isn't, but like this is just one of these things that for the last year we have consistently found, like charter schools, vouchers, ESAs, overwhelmingly positive, and that the number of detractors to them are actually quite low. I mean, like there's some people kind of in the messy middle, but I mean, I think policymakers should feel very, very confident when they are advancing these proposals that they have public backing on their side. And if and when, as they frequently do, they are bombarded on social media or via emails or people coming to the Capitol, asking the question, are those folks representative of their state as a whole or of their nation as a whole? Because if they're coming out and they're super fired up against these things, they are not representative of the nation.
And Jennifer, I have a question for you about that, because we both care very deeply about how things are communicated to the public. And I'm looking at this polling that you guys have done since since March of 20. And I would have never looked at it this way, but the strongly opposed to charter schools and to vouchers and to other things is pretty much a flat line. And it's a low flat line. I mean, in March of 20, it was 10% strongly opposed, and it's 8% now. And or that's somewhat opposed. Strongly opposed went from 8% down to 5% in that time period. And as a communications person, that must be a very loud 5%. Like they must be the loudest people with the biggest megaphones. Do you think we just simply have a comms problem on our hands too?
If I had a nickel for every time someone has asked me to change the narrative, I would not have to work for a living anymore. But it is a communications issue. It is a generational issue. I think if you look at our polling, the older generations, those who went to the more traditional schooling, red brick schoolhouse that we all have in our mind, versus younger generations that have had exposure to charters or exposure to private school choice or exposure to online learning now. I think that you see that narrative arc bending over time. But it is really difficult. These are, I say this to every time I do a presentation and someone says, yeah, but look at this 81%. I say, yeah, these are deeply personal conversations and decisions. I've got 2 kids. They're both in the same school right now. They probably shouldn't be. One's got ADHD and probably needs to be in an outdoor learning environment. The other one, she's a perfect fit for this school. And as we talk about this as advocates, I think that actually is our biggest communications issue, is that we assume, oh, well, this is just a cut and dry, I'll send them a postcard and they'll sign up for the neighborhood charter school issue, where it's not. And it's, we do some work in our other polling on net promotion and the net promoter score, and asking people, what would they net promote? We ask a lot about the teaching profession, but these are conversations that are had over family dinners or at church. They're not necessarily a conversation that you run a 30-second Super Bowl ad and suddenly everyone's at a charter school. So that's my take from the communication standpoint.
So I know that we're bumping up against time here, but I think that is a great point to round around to come back to, in the end, which is, number one, it is important to hear what real people think, because we are facing, in my mind, somewhat of a silent majority problem, which is silently what people say and do privately, with their own kids, and what they support is different than the public narrative. The public narrative right now is often very much, remote learning is a disaster. This pandemic learning situation is a disaster. Can't wait to get all back to normal. And I think we're hearing different things in your research. We're also definitely hearing it in other polls, which is just that for the first time, parents have had to think through some other options, and some of them kind of like them. And there's some steam and some upward movement of the imagination of the American parent, the imagination of what might be possible in terms of education, even though there's frustration. Definitely, we can't dismiss that. But the way that we discuss these things and we talk about them, I'm informed by your numbers here to think through the really loud group of people that are opposed to any types of choice, reform, education savings accounts, scholarships. That portion of the American public is actually a small minority, and they are very loud. So I think we need to get pretty loud for the majority that actually want to do different things with their kids. I'll leave the floor to you all if you have any final thoughts around what you want the public, number one, how the public and anyone listening can get to you, and if they want to write stories about this or if they want to talk about it more. The information you're polling, how they can get to that, and then any final words that you guys have in terms of the big headlines that you want people to take away from it.
I'll just very briefly, you can go edchoice.morningconsultintelligence.com. I think that is where all of our polling resources are. And the cool thing about that is we have all of the stuff going back to our first polling that we did. We have all of these cross tabs that we've mentioned where you look at various demographic groups. We have all of the questionnaires that we use. So everything that we do is completely transparent and completely public. You can see the exact questions that we asked, the exact findings that we had. If anyone who's on here who's a young researcher, if you're a college student, or if you have, you have to write a master's thesis or something, all of the data is there to write 40 of them. And we're happy to help with you, but all the resources are there. Folks can find stuff for themselves, and obviously don't hesitate to reach out via email or social media or anything if you have questions about our polling.
Yeah, I dropped my email into the chat. Feel free to email us at media@edchoice.org as well. That's a great way to connect with us. Echoing everything Mike just said, thank you to everyone who is patient today with our technical difficulties. Yesterday's session went flawlessly. This one did not, but that's okay. We got it. We got it done. And then, our unofficial mantra around EdChoice is that we want to help all kids get in where they fit in, right? And so, maybe you're not for private school choice.
Mhm.
Maybe you have questions about charter schools, but the pandemic, as reflected through our polling over the last year, has opened up a lot of people's eyes to your point, Chris, what's out there, what's possible, and maybe that things that we thought were working, they weren't working all that well. So how do we fix that and move forward? So thanks to everyone for joining our conversation. I'll kick it back to you, Chris, but please check out our polling and check out our website.
So again, just to hammer it home, the easiest way is just to go to edchoice.org and you will find a wealth of information, very well displayed and laid out, information across multiple states, every state, as a matter of fact, what type of school choice options there are. So if you are a parent or a student or a research assistant or a journalist and you want more information and you want to be informed for real and you want to have real information, go to edchoice.org. You'll find it there. Thank you again for everybody who was patient, as Jennifer said, with us around the technology today. But hey, it's a blessing anytime people are willing to come and participate and listen to matters around public education, educating our nation's youth. I can't think of a better thing for us to have some community around. So thank you all for joining us today.